You are listening to LawWithDenise.net, the best law podcast for A-level, undergraduate, GDL, and master's law students. Your host is Denise, your experienced law teacher sharing knowledge on various areas of law, including contract, tort, the English legal system, and criminal law. Understand the law better and learn the skills you need to get the grades you need.
Hi, welcome to the Law with Denise podcast. My name is Denise and you are listening to episode 006. Thank you very much for deciding to listen to the podcast. In this episode, what I will be doing is I'll be explaining the following. So my first question is, what is the EU and EU law? So what is the EU and what exactly is EU law? What are the main institutions in the European Union? And who sits in the institutions within the European Union, of course, and what are their powers? So first question, what is the European Union or what is the EU? Now, the EU is a group of 28 member countries, right? Today, we know this group as the European Union, or sometimes we say the EU, and its aims, we know, are both political and economic. So it's a political and economic union, and but the union grew out of a community established after the Second World War. And when it was established, the aim was really to establish peace and prosperity in Europe. But today, as we know it, it is a political and economic union. It was the Paris Treaty in 1951 which set up this coal and steel community. And the idea then was that a supernatural authority would take control of the then member states' coal and steel production in order to avoid war within Europe. Since then, the community has grown into, in terms of membership numbers, and also the aims and the focuses of the group has changed. And several treaties have been signed in order to reflect these changes. Some of these treaties have been have mainly focused on amendments to previous treaties. Now, this podcast is really for law students. I'm not going to really delve into the socio and economic and political reasons for these changes, nor am I going to really discuss any of those treaties. What I do want to mention is that the podcast is concerned with the following two treaties, and those are the Treaty of the European Union and the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And the reason for the focus on those two treaties is because these treaties constitute the treaties on which the Union is founded. And it is these treaties which are the primary source of European Union law. So when we speak about European Union law, EU law as law students, it is these treaties, these sources, and the secondary sources of law, which we'll discuss in the following episode, secondary sources of European law, such as regulations and directives, and also the case law, which comes from the European Justice, comes from the Court of Justice of European Union. Sorry, I was thinking of the old name. All right, it comes from the Court of Justice of European Union. The case law, the secondary sources, which you learn about in episode 007, and these two treaties, which are the Treaty of the European Union and the Treaty of the Function of the European Union. It is these pieces of law which constitute European Union law. So that's what we mean when we're talking about European Union law. Now, in order to understand European Union law, it is useful to understand the institutions that make up the European Union and their roles and their powers, especially with relevance to creating law. So that's the purpose for normally just going through the institutions. So what are the main institutions within the European Union? According to Article 13 of the Treaty of the European Union, these are the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Commission, the Central Bank, the Court of Auditors, and the European Parliament. In this podcast, I will focus on all but the Court of Auditors and the Central Bank. So I'm just going to focus on the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the Commission, and the European Parliament. So let me start off with the European Council. At one point, the European Council and the Council of, and what we call the Council of the European Union, were one body. They were one institution. But following one of the treaties, the Lisbon Treaty, there was a division between them. So now we officially recognize them as two separate institutions. The European Council, which is the one I'm focusing on now, consists of heads of state or government of the member states. And working within this institution is also a president. So the European Council has a president, and the president of the Commission, which is another institution we'll talk about later on in the podcast, also works with the European Council. There is also what we call the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And the person who holds this position also works in the European Council. So what do they do within the European Council? Well, first thing to note as a law student is that the European Council is actually a non-legislative body. So it really focuses on the political issues, and it defines the general policy direction for the European Union. But the Council of the European Union is a very significant body with regard to lawmaking. So who sits in the Council of the European Union? We have representatives, ministerial representatives from each member state, and this group is not permanent. Membership depends on the subject matter under discussion. So for example, if agriculture is being discussed, then ministers of agriculture will join the Council of the European Union, and they will be involved in discussion relevant to that. If the discussion is environmental, then ministers for environment will join the Council of Europe, and they will discuss that issue. But what does the Council of the European Union do? They're very important for us as law students because they are the final power of discussion on adoption of secondary legislation. Now we'll learn what these sources of secondary legislation are in episode 007. But for you right now, I want to just emphasize that they are the final power of discussion on adoption of these sources of law, secondary legislation. But this is exercised jointly with the European Parliament when we're talking about when the secondary legislation has to be passed through what we call ordinary legislative procedure. The Council of the European Union can also delegate power to the Commission and ask them to enact legislation. So who is the Commission, right? The Commission involves or includes a member from each member state, and they normally sit within the Commission for 5 years. And what do? As I said, the Council of European Union can delegate power to them to enact legislation, but they also formulate policy, they can propose legislation, and they are involved as well in the framing of legislation alongside the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. They're often referred to as the guardian of European Union law because they can bring actions against member states that are in breach of European Union law, and they would bring those actions to the Court of Justice of the European Union. Now let's move on to the European Parliament and look at who sits within the Parliament and exactly what they do. So within the European Parliament, there are elected members. There are elected members there, and they are elected within member states. So the members of the Parliament are elected within member states themselves. And what do? They approve the Commission, and they have the power to dismiss the entire Commission, right? But specifically, I want to emphasize for us as law students that the power of the European Parliament with regard to the passing of legislation has changed somewhat significantly since the Treaty of Lisbon. So prior to the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Parliament was really used as an advisory or consultative body with regard to legislation. But now the Parliament's approval is required when the ordinary legislative procedure applies. So now they are quite heavily involved in the enactment or the enacting of legislation when the ordinary legislative procedure applies. Then lastly, we need to examine the Court of Justice of the European Union, previously known as the European Court of Justice. And the court is very significant because from the courts we get case law, which has made up a significant amount of what we now know as European Union law. It is through the courts that we have seen certain principles develop, and some of those principles you will study when studying European Union law. Some of those would be like direct effect, indirect effect. So it's very important to understand what this court is and how it functions. So the Court of Justice of the European Union its main purpose is to make sure that European Union law is interpreted and observed throughout the member states. And how does it do that? When cases, it can give decisions. It has the power to judge whether a member state has failed its obligations. So it has that power. And it also has, under Article 267, the power to give what we refer to as preliminary rulings. Now, these preliminary rulings are not the same as judgments. So they're not decisions that they don't decide whether they're different to the other role that the court plays, in the sense that with this power, what the court does is it doesn't review the legality of the acts in question. What it does is it really explains European Union law, and it gets that power to give these preliminary rulings through Article 267 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. Now, when we look at different cases relevant to European Union law, you will see exactly how the court functions. But for now, I think it's very important for you to understand that the court is there to ensure interpretation and application of European Union law is observed. And it's also important for you to know that the court really has these two main broad functions. And the first one is the preliminary rulings on the interpretation of EU law, it has that power, it gets that power from Article 267 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And under Article 263 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, it gets the power to review the legality of the acts of institutions. And it's also important to remember that the court also has the power to judge whether a member state has failed its obligations. Who can ask the court to judge whether a member state has failed its obligations? It can be an institution, for example, the Commission. It can be another member state, or it can be an individual, a person from a member state can ask the court to judge whether a member state has failed its obligations. And these obligations would be obviously obligations set out in either primary or secondary law. Who sits in this court? Well, the court officially has a judge from each member state, but when cases are being discussed or addressed, normally it's 3 or 5 judges that will sit. On some occasions, we'll have more. For example, we may have the grand chamber of 13, but in most cases, it's 3 or 5 judges who sit together to discuss these cases. So I hope that was useful. Please remember, if you want to find out more about the different types of law passed through the European Union, please listen to episode 007, where I'll be explaining more about the different types of secondary legislation and giving some case examples demonstrating how the Court of Justice of the European Union actually works. Thank you.
You've been listening to LawWithDenise.net, the best law podcast for A-level, undergraduate, GDL, and master's law students. Your experienced law teachers sharing knowledge on various areas of law, including contract, tort, the English legal system, and criminal law. If you like the content, please remember to like, share, and comment. Thank you.